An elderly mother is frequently mistreated by her alcohol-addicted son. But one night, he does something unforgivable to the poor lady. However, the horse heard everything. What the animal did left the mother speechless. Look, if you, like us, love animals, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any heartwarming stories. Thanks. Let's get back to our story. Mary watched the rain from the kitchen window, her wrinkled fingers absently stroking the now cold coffee mug. The leaden sky of late afternoon poured its tears onto the parched fields of Willow Creek Ranch. Once a thriving piece of land that her late husband Tony had cultivated with so much love. Now, like herself at 72 years old, the property showed the inexorable marks of time and neglect. A familiar neigh reached her ears, bringing a small smile to her lips. Patches, the old Appaloosa horse who had been Tony's inseparable companion, was restless in his stall. Mary knew the animal always got agitated when a storm was approaching, as if he could sense something beyond the thunder and lightning announcing themselves on the horizon. Her tired eyes wandered around the kitchen, pausing on the empty spaces on the walls where family photos had once hung. Her heart ached as she remembered the night Paul, her son, had torn all the pictures down in one of his drunken rages. The lighter marks on the faded wallpaper were like scars, constantly reminding her of what they had lost. The familiar creak of the stairs announced Paul's descent. Mary straightened her shoulders instinctively, her hands tightening around the mug. At 47 years old, her only child was a shadow of the man he used to be. Since the accident that had taken Anna, his wife, and little Mikey, his 8-year-old son Paul, had plunged into an abyss of guilt and remorse from which he seemed unable to emerge. "Where's the coffee?" His voice sounded rough, heavy with the deep sleep that always overcame him after his long sessions with the bottle. Mary closed her eyes, the words as familiar as they were painful. 5 years had passed since that fateful night, but Paul still blamed her for not stopping him from getting behind the wheel after the party, as if she hadn't tried, as if she hadn't pleaded, argued, even threatened to call the cops. But Paul had always been stubborn as his father, and that night, a particularly loud clap of thunder shook the windows of the house, interrupting her thoughts. Patches neighed again, more urgently this time. Mary got up, feeling the need to check on the animal. Something in her gut told her this wouldn't be an ordinary night. "That old horse, we should have sold him years ago. Just eats and doesn't give anything back." Paul staggered slightly, leaning against the wall. "Just like you." But today, there was something different in the air. Something beyond the electricity of the approaching storm. Maybe it was the dangerous glint in Paul's eyes, or the way his hands trembled more than usual. Mary felt a chill run down her spine when he grabbed her arm, preventing her from leaving. Mary felt the grip on her arm tighten, but it wasn't the physical pain that scared her the most. It was Paul's look, a mixture of despair and fury that she had been witnessing with increasing frequency in recent months. The rain began to fall harder outside, as if the sky shared the anguish that filled the old house. "Talk?" He let out a bitter laugh, finally releasing her arm. "Now you want to talk? Where was this desire to talk that night, Mom?" "I tried to stop you," she whispered, the words escaping before she could contain them. "You wouldn't listen to me. You never listened to me." Another thunderclap shook the house, and Patch's distressed neigh echoed again. Mary looked anxiously towards the back door, her heart divided between concern for the animal and fear of leaving Paul alone in this state. Paul stopped, swaying slightly, his bloodshot eyes fixing on his mother's face. "You always defending that horse. You know how much it costs to keep that useless animal. The money we spend on him could—" The mention of his father seemed to hit Paul like a punch. He staggered back, leaning on the kitchen table. For a moment, Mary saw tears forming in his eyes, and her heart filled with hope. Maybe, just maybe, today would be different. "No!" Paul pulled away sharply, knocking over a chair. "You don't understand anything. Nobody understands. I killed them, Mom. I killed my family." "Honey," she began, but Paul was already moving, his hands trembling as he searched through the kitchen drawers. "Don't lie to me," he yelled, turning to face her. "You hid them, didn't you? Always trying to control everything, always thinking you know what's best for me." The storm roared outside, and Patches continued his agitation in the barn. Mary could feel the tension building in the kitchen like electricity before lightning. Something was about to explode, and she didn't know if she could contain it this time. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the kitchen for a brief instant. In that flash, Mary saw Paul's face transformed by anger and despair. Her son looked like a different person, someone she barely recognized. Shadows danced on the walls when the darkness returned, and the thunder that followed made the windows shake. "You always wanted to control my life," Paul continued, his voice choked up. "Since I was little, always telling me what I should or shouldn't do. If I had listened to you less, maybe." The words seemed to hit Paul like a slap. He staggered back, knocking over another chair. The sound of wood hitting the floor mixed with another neigh from Patches, more urgent this time. Mary backed up until she felt the cold wall at her back. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it wanted to escape her chest. In all these years of conflict, she had never seen her son so out of control. "The booze," he laughed, a bitter and painful sound. "The booze is the only thing that helps me forget, the only thing that makes the pain stop for a few moments." "There you go again, more worried about that old horse than about me." He punched the wall next to Mary's head, making her flinch. "You know what I should do? I should end that animal once and for all. Maybe then you'll understand what it's like to lose someone you love." The rain was falling with full force now, turning the outside world into a blurry grey. The lightning was becoming more frequent, and the thunder seemed to make the whole house shake. Or maybe it was Mary who was shaking. "Son." Mary hesitated, knowing that the truth could be dangerous, but unable to keep lying. "The pictures, you burned them 3 months ago, on a night like this." "Liar!" The scream came accompanied by a brusque movement. Paul grabbed Mary's arms, shaking her. "You're lying! I would never do that. You hid the pictures, confess." In the barn, Patches began to kick against the door with force, as if he sensed the danger. The rhythmic sound of the hooves on the dirt floor mixed with the storm, creating a chaotic symphony that seemed to foreshadow a tragedy. That's when it happened. In his state of fury and despair, Paul pushed Mary hard. She stumbled backwards, trying to balance herself, but her reflexes were no longer the same. Her body spun in the air for a fraction of a second before her head hit the corner of the table with a thud. The world seemed to slow down at that moment. Mary felt a sharp pain in her temple, and her vision darkened for a moment. Through the buzzing in her ears, she heard Paul's horrified scream, mixed with the sound of the storm, and Patches' increasingly frantic neighs. "Mom?" Paul's voice sounded distant and scared, like a little boy's. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Then something extraordinary happened. A particularly strong lightning bolt illuminated the entire kitchen, followed immediately by a deafening thunderclap. At the same instant, a crash was heard from the barn, the unmistakable sound of wood breaking. Patches had managed to break down the loosely closed barn door. The sound of hooves on the dirt floor grew louder, approaching the house. Paul and Mary, still on the floor, stared in astonishment at the kitchen door as it opened violently, pushed open by the horse's determined muzzle. Patches entered the kitchen, his imposing figure filling the room. Rainwater dripped from his Appaloosa coat, and his dark eyes shone with an almost supernatural intelligence. The animal looked first at Mary, lying on the floor, then at Paul, still kneeling beside her. But Patches didn't wait for him to finish the sentence. With surprising agility for his age, the horse moved forward, placing himself between Mary and Paul. His hooves clattered on the kitchen's wooden floor, making a threatening sound. Patches responded with a deep neigh, his ears pinned back in warning. Mary, still lying on the floor, watched the scene with a mixture of astonishment and gratitude. The horse her husband had loved so much was there, protecting her as if he understood exactly what was happening. "Shut up!" Paul screamed, taking a step forward. But Patches was faster. The horse nudged Paul with his chest, making him stumble back until he hit the wall. The impact wasn't strong, but it was enough for Paul to slide to the floor, dazed. Mary understood immediately. With effort, and leaning on the animal's wet mane, she managed to get up and climb onto his back. Patches rose carefully, ensuring she was secure. "I love you, honey," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "but I need to go." Behind them, she heard Paul shout her name one more time, his voice lost in the noise of the storm. Mary closed her eyes, letting the tears mix with the rain that washed her face. Patches kept going, his hooves finding firm footing even on the muddy road. The rain lashed mercilessly as Patches moved along the dark road. Mary felt her body ache, both from the blow to her temple and from the uncomfortable position on the animal's wet back. It had been decades since she had ridden, and never in these conditions. Her frozen fingers gripped Patches' soaked mane as if her life depended on it, and maybe it did. "Good boy," she murmured through chattering teeth, leaning closer to the horse's neck for some warmth. "You always knew, didn't you? Always felt when I was scared." A lightning flash momentarily illuminated the landscape, revealing the familiar outlines of the road leading to town. Mary recognized the old gnarled oak tree that marked the creek bend. It was approximately 3 miles from her sister Lucy's. Under normal conditions, it would be an hour's walk, but in this storm, riding an elderly horse, Patches neighed softly as if responding to her thoughts. His steps were surprisingly steady in the mud, as if he knew the way by instinct. Mary closed her eyes, letting more tears flow. It wasn't just raindrops soaking her face now. The memories came like flashbacks, as vivid as the pain in her temple. Paul as a little boy, running around the yard, his smile lighting up the world. Paul as a teenager, standing proudly beside his father after fixing his first tractor. Paul as an adult, introducing Anna for the first time, his eyes shining with love. The birth of Mikey, happiness overflowing in tears of joy. And then, the night of the accident, the phone call, the hospital, the deafening silence that followed. And gradually, day after day, the transformation of her son into someone she barely recognized. The horse snorted, shaking his head as if agreeing, and resumed his determined march. Mary realized they were leaving the main road, following a secondary path that wound through the pastures. It was a longer route, but also safer. Less chance of encountering vehicles on this stormy night. Her thoughts returned to Paul, alone on the ranch. Part of her wanted to go back. She couldn't avoid maternal worry. Was he hurt? Had he hit his head hard? What if he did something stupid? But another part, a part that had been growing silently over the years, knew that she needed to leave, not just for her own safety, but also for Paul's. At the time, Mary had dismissed her sister's advice. How could she abandon her only son when he needed her the most? But now, riding Patches under the relentless rain, she began to understand. Her unconditional love, her constant presence, her willingness to be the target of all Paul's anger and guilt. All of this had turned into crutches that prevented him from truly facing his demons. Patches stumbled slightly, bringing Mary back to the present. The rain had lessened a little, but the cold intensified. Her soaked clothes weighed like lead, and she could feel the horse panting with the effort. It was true. While she had allowed herself to be consumed by guilt and Paul by remorse, Patches had remained a constant and comforting presence. How many nights had she cried in the barn, finding solace only in the silent companionship of the old horse? How many times had he responded to her outpourings with that understanding look that seemed to understand every word? Another lightning bolt flashed across the sky, and Mary glimpsed something familiar in the distance. The city lights began to dot the horizon like earthly stars. They were getting there. But as Patches bravely strode through the night, she couldn't help but think of the son she had left behind, and the long road to recovery he would need to travel alone. The city lights grew closer, like beacons guiding a ship through the storm. Mary recognized the cobblestone street leading to Lucy's house, a modest corner house with a small front yard and a white picket fence that her sister religiously painted every year. Patches slowed his pace as he entered the lit street, his hooves making a rhythmic sound on the wet stones. Even exhausted from the journey, the animal maintained a dignity of his own, as if he understood the importance of his mission. "Good heavens!" Lucy's voice cut through the silence of the night when Mary and Patches arrived at the gate. Her sister was on the porch, probably drawn by the unusual sound of hooves on the street at that hour. "Mary, is that you?" "Help!" Lucy shouted, running to the gate. "George, get out here quick!" "I'll take care of the horse." A new voice joined the group. It was Peter, Lucy's teenage son, who was already running to the backyard. "I'll get the shed ready for him. There's hay stored there." "He did this, didn't he?" Lucy asked as she helped George put Mary on the bed in the guest room. "Did Paul do this?" "And you're my sister," Lucy retorted, but her voice softened when she saw the despair in Mary's eyes. All right. But you're not going back to that ranch, you hear me? Enough of trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved." Dr. Rick arrived 15 minutes later, his chubby figure bringing an aura of professional calm to the agitated room. He examined the wound on Mary's temple, checked her vital signs, and listened attentively to the broken account of the journey in the storm. Mary nodded weakly, feeling the warmth of the blankets begin to thaw her limbs. Outside, she heard Peter talking gently to Patches, the comforting sound of the brush on the animal's wet mane. Lucy sat on the edge of the bed, holding her sister's hand. "Rest now. We'll talk better tomorrow." "Do you think he'll be all right?" she asked softly, and everyone in the room knew she wasn't talking about the horse. Mary squeezed her sister's hand, letting the words echo in her tired mind. Outside, the storm began to subside, as if its fury had served only to trace this new path in her life. Paul remained sitting on the kitchen floor for a long time after his mother left, the sound of Patches' hooves still echoing in his ears. The rain continued to fall outside, but he barely noticed, lost in a whirlwind of emotions that began to break through the alcoholic haze in his mind. His eyes fixed on the small spot of blood on the corner of the table, and a wave of nausea hit him. What had he done? How had he come to this point? The memories of the last few minutes, his mother fallen, Patches bursting into the kitchen, the look of fear in her eyes, began to crystallize in his consciousness with painful clarity. Slowly, Paul got up, his legs trembling. He staggered to the cabinet where he kept his bottles of liquor, and, for the first time in 5 years, the simple smell of alcohol repulsed him. With a cry of anger, this time directed at himself, he began to grab the bottles one by one, pouring their contents down the sink. The amber liquid flowed down the drain, taking with it years of escape and denial. Each emptied bottle was like a weight being removed from his soul, even though the true burden of his actions remained. "How could I do this to her, Dad?" he murmured, picking up the photo frame with trembling hands. "How did I let it get to this point?" "No!" Paul pressed his palms against his eyes, as if he could stop the memories from coming. But this time it was different. This time there was no alcohol to numb the pain, to help him escape the truth. "I need help," he admitted aloud, the words echoing in the empty house. It was the first time he had acknowledged this since the accident. The voice that answered on the other end of the line was gentle and professional. Paul took a deep breath, gathering all his courage. The words came out now like a torrent, years of denial and repressed guilt finally finding escape. Paul spoke about the accident, about Anna and Mikey, about how he had blamed his mother for something that was entirely his responsibility. Paul spent the rest of the night packing a small bag, his hands still trembling, but now with a different purpose. In every room of the house, he saw evidence of his mother's unconditional love. The meals always ready, the clothes clean and ironed, the infinite patience with his destructive behavior. Outside, the storm finally began to pass, as if nature recognized that its catalytic function had been fulfilled. The first ray of sunshine of the morning found Mary sitting on the back porch of Lucy's house, watching Patches graze peacefully in the small yard. The horse seemed to have recovered well from the night journey, his Appaloosa coat shining under the golden light of dawn. "I figured I'd find you here," Lucy said softly, handing a warm cup of coffee to her sister. "Didn't sleep at all, did you?" The sound of hooves on the grass made both look at Patches, who was approaching the porch. The horse stretched his long neck over the low fence, as if he wanted to participate in the conversation. Peter, who had just left for school, stopped to pet the animal. Mary felt tears forming in her eyes. "Of course you can, honey. Patches will like that." "Simply nothing," Lucy interrupted her firmly. "You almost died yesterday. If it weren't for this extraordinary horse—" She paused, looking with admiration at Patches. "I still can't believe what you told me. How did he know?" The sisters shared a moment of silence, each lost in their own memories. The distant sound of the city waking up, cars passing, neighbors talking, birds singing, created a surreally normal atmosphere for a day that followed such an extraordinary night. As Regina cleaned and changed the bandage on her temple, Mary watched the street activity through the living room window. How different from the loneliness of the ranch, where the days dragged on in a silence punctuated only by Paul's outbursts. The rest of the morning passed slowly. George, before leaving for work, had insisted that Mary use his old office to rest. A cozy room with a comfortable armchair and a view of the yard where Patches grazed. It was there, lulled by the soft sound of the fan and the occasional neigh from Patches, that Mary finally managed to fall asleep. Her sleep, though restless, was populated not by nightmares of the confrontation with Paul, but by old memories. Her young son running through the yard, Tony teaching him to ride, Anna pregnant with Mikey, all sitting on the porch of the ranch on a Sunday afternoon. "Mary!" Lucy's voice woke her gently. "There's a phone call. It's from the rehab center in the next town over." "Mom?" Paul's voice sounded different, clear, without the dullness of alcohol, but also broken, vulnerable. "Mom, I'm so sorry." Mary squeezed the phone tightly, her heart beating so loud she was sure Paul could hear it on the other end of the line. Lucy remained beside her, a protective hand on her shoulder, while Patches watched attentively from the window, as if he felt the importance of the moment. "No, Mom," he replied after a moment of hesitation. "I haven't been all right for a long time, but I think I finally get it. When you left last night," he continued, his voice choked up, "when I saw you hurt running away from me, it was like something broke inside me, something that had been frozen since that night. Please, Mom, let me talk. I need to say this while I have the courage." There was a sound of deep breathing on the other end. "I've spent 5 years blaming you for something that was entirely my fault. I was drunk that night. I decided to drive. His voice faltered for a moment. "I killed Anna and Mikey. It wasn't you, it wasn't fate, it wasn't bad luck. It was me." Mary squeezed Lucy's hand, seeking strength to hear the words her son needed to say. Outside, Patches neighed softly, as if offering his own support. "You've always been there, always trying to help me, protect me, even from myself. And how did I repay you? By hurting you more and more." His voice trembled. "When I saw the blood yesterday, when I realized what I had done. Mom, I've never hated myself as much as in that moment. Only because Patches had more sense than me." Paul let out a sad laugh. "It took a horse invading the kitchen and saving you from me for me to finally see what I had turned into." "The doctors here say the process will be long," Paul continued, his voice more controlled now. "There's detox first, then therapy. It's going to take time, Mom. And I understand if you don't want to see me during this period." "You've always been stronger than me," Paul replied, and Mary could hear the sad smile in his voice. "You know what's the most ironic? I remember Dad always saying that Patches was the smartest horse he had ever seen. I guess he was right. That animal did what no one else could in 5 years, made me see the truth." "I'm going to take care of the ranch while I'm here," Paul said. "I asked for help from Mr. Johnson, our neighbor. He's going to check on things, keep everything in order until you can come back, if you want to come back someday." Mary felt her heart clench. "I'm sure they do, honey, But first you need to forgive yourself." Mary nodded, wiping away the tears. "Yes, sis, and sometimes that's all we need, a place to start." The weeks that followed established a new routine in Mary's life. Every morning she had coffee on the back porch with Lucy, watching Peter take care of Patches before going to school. The boy had developed a special bond with the horse, who seemed to reciprocate the affection with his usual silent wisdom. "He's different from the other horses I've ever seen," Peter commented one morning while brushing Patches' coat. "It's like he understands everything we say." "He asks about you a lot," the social worker commented during one of the weekly calls. "But he understands that he needs to respect your space and your time." One afternoon, while helping Lucy water the plants in the garden, Mary received a surprise. The mailman delivered an envelope from the rehab center. Inside, there was a letter from Paul, written by hand. The words that followed were a mixture of confession and reflection. Paul wrote about his therapy sessions, about how he was finally facing the grief over the loss of Anna and Mikey without the shield of alcohol. He talked about the memories that came back, some painful, others sweet. "Yesterday I dreamed about Mikey," read one passage of the letter. "It wasn't a nightmare like before. He was in the yard of the ranch, playing with Patches, laughing in that way that only he knew how to laugh. I woke up crying, but it was a different kind of cry. I think the therapist calls this healthy grieving." Mary needed to pause several times during the reading, her hands trembling slightly. Lucy respected her space, keeping busy with her chores, but always nearby in case her sister needed her. Patches, who was grazing in the yard, approached the window as he always did when he sensed that Mary was emotional. His muzzle gently touched the glass, fogging it with his breath. Mary got up, walking to the window to pet Patches through the glass. The horse remained there, offering his silent comfort as she finished reading the letter. That night during dinner, Mary was quieter than usual. Her thoughts wandered between the ranch, the rehab center, and all the memories that built the bridge between those two places. "You know, Lucy," she replied softly, "I think for the first time in a long time, I can say that yes, I'm starting to be okay." 3 months had passed since that stormy night. Winter was beginning to give way to spring, and with it, small changes flourished in Mary's life. Paul's letters arrived weekly now, each one revealing new progress in his recovery. "I completed 90 days sober today," said his latest letter. "The therapist said it's an important milestone. But you know what's more important to me, Mom? It's the clarity. For the first time in years, I can think without that constant haze of alcohol." "Mrs. Mary!" Peter ran into the office one afternoon, his eyes shining with excitement. "You have to see this. Patches learned a new trick. He did it on his own the other day, when he wanted to reach the apples I had left on this side," Peter explained proudly. "Since then, I've been practicing with him." "Mary?" Lucy's voice interrupted the moment. She was standing at the back door, holding the phone. "It's from the rehab center. Paul wants to know if you'd accept a visit." Mary looked at Patches, as if seeking advice. The horse tilted his head slightly, his wise eyes fixed on her. Before leaving, she went to the yard to say goodbye to Patches. The horse seemed to feel the importance of the moment, keeping especially close as she stroked his neck. "Your son has done a remarkable job," she commented as she guided Mary to the visiting room. "He's one of the most inspiring cases I've ever worked with." "Mom," he said softly, taking a hesitant step towards her. The conversation flowed slowly, starting hesitant but gaining strength. Paul talked about his treatment, about the discoveries he had been making in therapy. Mary told about her new routine at Lucy's house, about the garden she was cultivating. "Dad always knew things," Paul agreed, his eyes shining with contained tears. "Mom, is there a day that comes?" 6 months had passed since the night of the storm. Summer was coming to an end, painting the sky with golden tones that reminded Mary of afternoons on the ranch. Visits to Paul at the rehab center had become regular, and each encounter revealed more of the son she had known before the tragedy. "I've been discharged," Paul announced during a visit, his voice mixing pride and apprehension. "Dr. Helen says I'm ready to go home." "Paul," Mary interrupted him gently, "the ranch is our home. It always has been." Paul nodded, understanding. "I'm scared too, Mom, but Dr. Helen taught me that fear can be a teacher, not just an obstacle." "Patches," she said suddenly, "I think he'll show us the way." As if responding, Patches walked to the gate he had learned to open, manipulating the latch with his familiar muzzle. Mary couldn't help but smile at the coincidence. Or was it a sign? Mary opened her arms, and her great-nephew ran into her embrace, as he used to do when he was younger. "I'm going to miss you, honey, and so will Patches." "Are you sure, sis?" she asked, holding Mary's hand. "There's no need to rush." "He called me every week," the neighbor said. "He wanted to know every detail, to make sure everything was perfect for when you came back." "I know I can't erase the past," he wrote in his last letter before returning. "But I can work to build a different future, a future where you feel safe and loved in your own home, Mom." On the morning chosen for the return, Mary woke up before the sun. She found Patches already awake, as if he too knew that this would be a special day. The morning was clear and cool when George's car turned onto the ranch road. Mary sat in the passenger seat with Lucy in the back while Peter followed on his bike alongside Mr. Johnson's pickup truck, which transported Patches. Mary's heart quickened as the familiar outlines of the house began to emerge. The newly painted white walls gleamed in the morning sun, and the front garden was unrecognizable. No longer overgrown with weeds, but carefully restored with all the flowers she had always loved. The car stopped, and for a moment, no one moved. It was Patches' neigh that broke the spell. The horse, eager to get out of the truck, seemed to await anxiously his own participation in this moment. Peter was already helping Mr. Johnson lower the ramp for Patches, but the horse waited, his attentive eyes fixed on Mary and Paul, as if awaiting the right moment. Mary took a step forward, and Paul did the same. The distance between them diminished not only physically, but also emotionally. Years of hurt and pain began to dissolve under the sun of that promising morning. It was then that Patches decided to make his entrance. With an elegant movement, he descended the ramp of the truck and walked until he was between mother and son, exactly as he had done on that stormy night. But this time, there was no fear or urgency in his gestures, just a wise and comforting presence. Mary approached, touching the other side of Patches' neck. Her fingers found her son's, and for the first time in years, there was no tension in that contact. Lucy and George began to unload Mary's things, while Peter, unable to contain his excitement, ran to show Patches his old stable, now completely renovated. "They're new," Paul explained, noticing his mother's gaze on the framed photographs. "I found some with Mr. Johnson, others with Aunt Lucy. They're not all the ones we had before, but this one's my favorite." Paul pointed to a particular photo. In it, Mary was in the ranch garden years ago, laughing as Patches tried to eat an apple from her hand. "It shows something I learned in these months, that true love always finds a way back home." Patches, who had followed everyone inside, neighed softly as if agreeing. The sound echoed through the house, no longer a place of pain and bitter memories, but a renewed space, ready for new beginnings. A year had passed since the return to the ranch. The seasons changed, the garden bloomed and withered and bloomed again, and with each cycle, life on the property found a more harmonious rhythm. Mary, sitting in her rocking chair on the porch, watched the rising sun painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. Patches grazed peacefully in the nearby field, his Appaloosa coat standing out against the clear horizon. The horse was no longer as agile as before. The years were beginning to weigh on his movements, but his eyes maintained that special gleam of wisdom that had always characterized him. "Good morning, Mom." Paul appeared on the porch, bringing 2 cups of coffee. He was returning from his morning walk, a habit he had developed during rehab and maintained faithfully. "Did you sleep well?" "Aunt Mary, Uncle Paul." The boy waved animatedly, pedaling to the porch. "I brought fresh apples for Patches." "You know, Mom," Paul commented, watching Peter run to meet Patches. "Sometimes I think about how everything could have been different if I hadn't been drinking that night. If Anna and Mikey—" "We can't change the past, honey," she said gently, "but look at what we've managed to build anyway. Anna and Mikey would be proud to see you today. The family support group is coming here next weekend," he commented. "I thought we could use the field next to the barn for the meeting. There are several people who want to meet Patches. After I told our story, he became something of a celebrity." The sun was already higher now, and the ranch came alive with the sounds of the day beginning. Mr. Johnson passed by with his tractor, waving cheerfully. In recent months, he and Paul had formed a partnership that was gradually putting the property back on track. Paul smiled at his mother and went to join his nephew. Mary watched the two interacting with the horse, their light hearts and sincere laughter echoing across the field. It was a scene that, a year ago, would have seemed impossible. Lucy had once said that sometimes we need to get completely lost to find our way back. Mary thought about this now, seeing how each piece had fallen into place in a mysterious and perfect way. Even that terrible stormy night had been necessary to break the destructive patterns and pave the way for healing. Mary got up from her chair and walked over to them. Patches greeted her with a soft neigh of recognition, as he did every morning. His coat was beginning to show more white spots, signs of advancing age, but his eyes maintained that special glimmer that seemed to see into people's souls. "Yes, honey," Mary replied, exchanging a meaningful look with Paul, "an angel who taught us that it's never too late to start over, that true love knows how to wait, and that sometimes miracles come in the most unexpected forms."